Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Monday, October 14th. Today is day 374. Over the weekend, the United States announced that they plan to send an anti-missile system to Israel along with American troops to operate it, which will bolster Israel's defenses against Iran. This was reported exclusively by the Wall Street Journal. The new deployment means that U.S. troops, U.S. soldiers, could actively engage in fighting between Israel and Iran on Israeli soil. The IDF also said that it killed the commander of an anti-tank unit in Hezbollah's elite Radwan force in an airstrike. The Israelis also demanded that 25 additional villages evacuate from southern Lebanon immediately. A senior Israeli political source told Haaretz that Israel will continue its attacks upon Beirut in the coming days. This refuted a report from a broadcaster on Israel's public news, stating that the government had ordered the IDF to stop striking the Lebanese capital. Sirens blared throughout Tel Aviv and across central Israel over the weekend as Hezbollah fired over 75 rockets after midnight on Sunday, according to the IDF. One person was lightly wounded by falling shrapnel in the north of Israel, and 4 Israeli soldiers were killed by a Hezbollah drone that struck an IDF base on central Israel on Sunday. They were all sergeants in the Israeli forces. A preliminary IDF investigation found that the drone had been flying at a low altitude for about half an hour, which led to the assumption that it had crashed and therefore it was not intercepted. According to the findings, the IDF initially detected the drone and then lost track of it. The UN peacekeeping force in South Lebanon said that 2 Israeli tanks forced their way into one of the positions of the UN peacekeeping force. In a statement, UNIFIL said that the IDF had requested that it turn out its lights, and 2 hours later that the IDF had fired rounds nearby the camp. This wounded 15 different peacekeepers. The IDF claimed it had encroached on a UNIFIL position to evacuate soldiers that had been seriously injured in a missile attack. The U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said that he spoke with his Israeli counterpart Gallant to express his condolences for the Israeli soldiers that were killed, and he reiterated the importance of ensuring the safety and security of the UNIFIL forces and the Lebanese armed forces, and reinforced the need to pivot from military operations in Lebanon to a diplomatic pathway as soon as feasible. One of the critiques of the U.S. approach is that the U.S. on one hand keeps saying a diplomatic way forward is the only way possible, at the same time that they're actually sending weapons and now troops to the region. Spain's foreign minister and the EU's foreign policy chief both condemned attacks by Israel on the UN peacekeeping mission in Lebanon and UNIFIL as unacceptable, with Borrell saying that such attacks against UN peacekeepers constitute a grave violation of international law and are totally unacceptable, and that these attacks must stop immediately. The Lebanese Red Cross said that Israeli airstrikes in northern Lebanese village of Aito killed 18 people. This was the northernmost strike since Israel began its ground incursion earlier this month. And the U.S. State Department strongly encouraged U.S. citizens in Lebanon to leave the country immediately. In Gaza, 4 people were killed and 50 others were injured in an airstrike on the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in the central Gazan city of Deir al-Balah. There was a fire in a packed tent camp where displaced people have been living. Women and children were among those injured. What does this mean? It means that tents where people live were caught on fire. Videos showed at least one man being burned alive as people stood by and were at a loss as to what to do to stop the horror. The IDF said it was targeting militants hiding out among civilians and that the fire was sparked after the strike was apparently caused by secondary explosions. They said that they're investigating the incident. Medical sources in the Strip said that at least 10 people were killed and 30 wounded, including women and children, in an Israeli airstrike on a humanitarian aid distribution center at the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. The Palestinian Red Crescent Society said that the rescue teams are unable to reach the site. And an Israeli attack on a school turned shelter killed at least 15 people in central Gaza yesterday. We're continuing to get reports. I mean, every few days, an attack on a school. according to the civil defense in Gaza. The IDF said that they're investigating the reports. Earlier, 5 children were reportedly killed by a drone strike in northern Gaza. That was BBC News reporting. A New York Times investigation found that Israeli troops in Gaza have regularly forced captured Palestinians to act as human shields. According to the New York Times investigation, the IDF regularly forced captured Palestinians to carry out life-threatening reconnaissance missions to avoid putting Israeli soldiers at risk in the battlefield. While the extent of these operations is unknown, the Times reported that the practice has been used in at least 11 different military squads in 5 different cities across the Gaza Strip, and that officers from Israel's intelligence agencies have been involved. AP News reported that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is examining a plan to seal off humanitarian aid completely from North Gaza in an attempt to starve out Hamas, AP News reported. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris said that according to the UN, no food has entered North Gaza in nearly 2 weeks, and that Israel must urgently do more to facilitate the flow of aid to those in need. Civilians must be protected and must have access to food, water, and medicine. International humanitarian law must be respected. Our reports from humanitarian aid workers and agencies that are a part of the associations we're a part of have confirmed that no food has been allowed into Gaza in the month of October. The UN Human Rights Office said that it has been appalled by Israel's continued attacks in North Gaza, where tens of thousands of displaced Gazans are trapped. This is the situation we've been monitoring, where Netanyahu called for a mandatory evacuation of North Gaza, and then the entire North Gaza area was deemed a hostile combat zone. And people who were trying to evacuate have then been fired upon. The second phase of the polio vaccination campaign has begun in central Gaza, according to the World Health Organization. And Israeli authorities have said that 30 trucks transferred aid to Gaza through a port, a central Israeli port. Note, when we talk about 30 trucks, that number is so abysmal and so small, it doesn't begin to touch the desperate need in the entirety of the Gaza Strip. The death toll in Gaza is now at 42,289 Palestinians at a minimum. The New York Times just came out with a significant report about secret documents that have shown Hamas tried to persuade Iran to join in its October 7th attack. There were a number of findings from the minutes of 10 different meetings of Hamas leaders that were reviewed by the New York Times. The document showed the potential for a Hamas plan that was far bigger than the actual attacks on October 7th, including a September 11th style toppling of a Tel Aviv skyscraper, escalations having been avoided prior to 2020-21, where Hamas waited and falsely implied that they had been deterred, all the while waiting to plan a more major attack. The documents seem to confirm something that we've been discussing previously, that the decision to attack on October 7th was also influenced by Hamas's desire to disrupt efforts between Israel and Saudi Arabia in terms of normalization, and also that the attack sought to interrupt the entrenchment of Israel's occupation in the West Bank and Israeli efforts to exert greater control over the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, known to Jews as the Temple Mount and to Muslims and Palestinians as the Haram al-Sharif. Dozens of protesters blocked a key road in Tel Aviv while demonstrating for a hostage release deal in front of the defense ministry in the city, and the IDF announced that a 19-year-old sergeant was killed fighting in South Gaza. A 17-year-old Palestinian was killed during an IDF operation in Jenin, and a 14-year-old Palestinian was moderately wounded from gunfire. In January, 2 Palestinian American teenagers were killed in the West Bank, and the Washington Post published an article saying that there was no justice for Palestinian Americans. The family said that Tawfiq Abdul-Jabbar and Mohammed Al-Khdour, both 17-year-old U.S. citizens, were killed in the West Bank earlier this year, and their cases still remain unsolved. And in the world over the weekend, there was a pro-Israel journalist attacked in Barcelona, Pilar Rahola, who said, "They won't silence me," after being attacked by a far-left group. Finally, I wanted to share the story of the Japanese group Nihon Hidanko, a grassroots organization of atomic bomb survivors. from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who received the 2024 Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons and for demonstrating through witness testimony that nuclear weapons must never be used again. After the prize was announced, the co-chair of Nihon Hidankyo spoke to reporters in Tokyo, and they said, in Gaza, bleeding children are being held by their parents, and it's like Japan was 80 years ago. And in their receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize, they said, I thought those fighting hard for peace in Gaza would deserve it. The Japanese anti-nuclear campaigner whose group won the Nobel Prize said that he was surprised that they had won the award instead of people working to stop Israel's war on Gaza. So I wanted to be sure to call that to your attention. Democracy Now! Reported if you want to look that up. Finally, I'd encourage you to join us on October 17th. I'll be giving a readout from my most recent trip to the Middle East, where I was in Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. I was traveling with a delegation of bishops from the South African Council of Churches. And if you'd like to hear more about that, I hope you'll join us. May God go before us in our continued efforts towards peace. Amen.